A lot of people feel discouraged when they hear that, look, the Canadian market values Canadian experience. It is true, but I don't think that's the be all end all, right? It's not as if that you don't have Canadian experience, you're not going to be able to land a job. It's also okay to not be perfectly balanced across all roles that you play in an isolated moment. But for me, success is that over a period of time, when you look back, you've not let any of those balls fall significantly. So you've kept that balance across the different hats that you've worn and done justice to each one of them.
You're listening to the East Meets West Pakistani Professional Journeys podcast, released bi-weekly every Sunday at 5 p.m. on YouTube, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple iTunes. Welcome to the East Meets West Pakistani Professional Journeys podcast. Today we have Aun Ansari, who graduated from LUMS and a BSc in economics and has over 12 years of experience as a management consultant and sales and marketing professional working across North America, the Middle East, and Pakistan. He's worked in companies such as Unilever, PepsiCo, and now is an associate partner at McKinsey. Pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Azam. It's great to be here.
So we can kick things off. Do you mind just talking about your time in Pakistan?
Yeah, absolutely. Born and raised in Karachi, that's where I spent first 18 years of my life. My time in Pakistan is actually split across the three major cities, right? So Karachi is where I was raised and grew up in. I spent my undergrad years in Lahore, which were fantastic 4 years that I spent at LUMS. And then I essentially started off my professional journey in Islamabad, where I was working with Pakistan Tobacco Company. So I spent a couple of years there. As part of that, those 2 years as a management trainee there for marketing, I spent a lot of time traveling in Punjab. So the interiors of Punjab, a lot of the cities and kind of villages, figuring out how to sell tobacco and what trade marketing looks like. So a lot of time spent across there. And then I spent some time working in Lahore again when I was working with Pepsi as well. So those are the three major cities I spent most of the time. Fantastic early years in Pakistan, right? Like my schooling, my childhood friends that a lot of them are here now in Mississauga or in Canada with me are from Pakistan. So have a fantastic memories from that country, and my family is still there. My parents are there. So we try and go there every year. So yeah, it's a place I still call home.
Is there any good memories you have in terms of the travels you've done? So you mentioned you did a few places you went to. So in terms of that experience, how was that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my initial years of my career, especially starting off with a company like Pakistan Tobacco, which was a fantastic kind of learning ground, right? For any young kid coming out of university at the age of 21, 22, to work with a company that is so well entrenched in their processes and really takes you through the grind of trying to understand what the work is on ground when you're into sales and marketing. So a lot of my experience of having to go into cities like Jung and seeing the cultures there, seeing how actually people work was really enlightening, right? So I remember spending time in Faisalabad and traveling every day to Jung from there and just understanding the different belief structures that people have, how important multiple different shrines are, having gone to even, let's say, the Heer Ranjha shrine. And I don't know if you're aware of, but it's obviously a folklore, but they've also converted that into a shrine. And you see a lot of people there congregated, having some kind of prayer or the other, looking forward for that to be accepted. So those experiences at an early age were quite enlightening. And then I traveled a lot of that interior Punjab on the back of a motorcycle with a salesman or a sales promoter. At the time, you were allowed to put tobacco advertising. So having to put those posters on different shops and 38, 40-degree temperature a lot of times was, at the time, I was like, why am I doing that? I just graduated out of LUMS. Why the hell am I on a motorbike putting posters on? But it was an extremely enlightening learning experience, having gone through that mill to really understand how the work is done on the ground.
Awesome. So did you have any key connections from Pakistan that has shaped you as a professional?
My first initiation into the corporate world, or first exposure of the corporate world, is through my parents, right? Both my parents are working individuals who've been in that corporate sphere all their lives to this stage. So those are my dad and my mom are my first exposure to that world, and I've learned a lot from them. So that goes without saying. Beyond that, I was lucky enough to find some really great mentors very early on, right? At PTC as well as at Pepsi, I was able to nurture a lot of those relationships that I hold dear to me even to this date. One of my mentors actually moved to Canada a few years before I did, and he used to work in Deloitte, right, as a consultant. So I learned a lot from him. And then similarly, when I go back to Pakistan, I try my best. It doesn't happen all the time, but I try my best to keep those connections alive and take some time out to even meet some of them for coffee, just to kind of exchange how they're doing, how I've been doing, how I'm thinking about my career. So I think those first few years and the mentors that you develop are just so important to keep you grounded, as well as to give you some kind of roadmap to how you want to shape your career going forward as well.
Did these mentors develop it just developed as you worked, or did you do certain efforts that allowed you to get the mentors, or what was that process like?
Yeah. I think at some level, the common thread is that for me at least was that I was working with them, right? So that's
Yeah.
the first common thread. Beyond that, I think just working on a 9 to 5 job with someone I don't think that's sufficient enough to deepen relationships, right? You
Okay.
do need to take that time out to have that connection, and it doesn't need to be outside of the workspace. It could be in the workspace, but beyond your everyday day-to-day job, and take a step back and have a connection and have a conversation about, look, how your experience is going in a company or doing a certain type of work, understand from them what their journey has been, seek other common grounds of interest, whether it's sport, whether it's a field that you're working in. So for me, for example, a lot of the people I worked in my early career, I would make sure that I am spending 30 minutes with them every month or so, trying to get feedback on what I am doing, how I am doing, plus how their journey has been, and also showcase a little bit of my work, and never shy away from knocking on someone's door and just grabbing a cup of coffee or tea and having that conversation with them, or sharing a meal over lunch and just talking through beyond what you're doing or the work that you're doing, and trying to connect with the other person as an individual and a person. And I feel that Pakistan is one place that allows you to do that quite a bit. I felt coming to Canada and North America in general, a lot of those conversations tend to be very formalized. Whereas in Pakistan, it's a lot easier, right? You've got so much commonality. There's so many different topics to engage on. The pop culture experience is very similar. The political landscape everybody's going through. So there are just so many different things that you can talk about. But it's important for you to do that, to cultivate a relationship and understand people that you're working with at a more personal level. And once you do that, I think there are certain individuals whose wavelength will match with you, and if they are on a path, or they've taken a path that you look up to or aspire to, then you can convert those relationships into more mentorships and seek advice and seek guidance and kind of build from there.
Really good point to bring up. So at least when you graduated, how did you go about even landing your first role? Because I feel that first role is pretty hard as a student. So did you have like internships during your university?
Yeah, so I did have internships. You mentioned Unilever at the start. My exposure to or experience at Unilever is of internships, right? I remember as a sophomore, in my sophomore year, I did get an internship at Unilever, did well enough to be offered, because I wasn't graduating that end of that year, right? So I had another couple of years to go. And I still remember the HR director at the time, he's passed away, but he offered me a second internship based on the final presentation that I gave on my first one. I knew that in my junior year, again, I had Unilever locked in as my final internship that I'm going to do in my university years. So I went to Unilever again. So I ended up having 2 internships in my university years at Unilever. And in my mind, that was almost a shot for me to land a job there. And it so happened that when the time came for me to graduate and get a job, I went through the Unilever process and I failed to make it through. And that was a bit of a dent, right? Because I had always expected, given that I've run 2 internships, had good reviews, the HR director is someone who is obviously appreciative of my work, is offering me another internship. Mentally, I thought it was almost a given that I'm going to end up working there. And it didn't happen. Such was luck. But I remember at the time, I was in final year of LUMS. A lot of these companies come in, set up booths, have a career fair, and case, as is the case with most universities. Pakistan Tobacco Company had come and done that. They had a competition which was called like Battle of Minds or something like that. They had a booth set up for interested candidates, but it was only for MBA students.
Okay.
And I was not an MBA student. And I remember I was roaming the halls of LUMS with resumes in my hand, handing it over to all the different companies who would be hiring undergraduate students. And I had an extra one in my hand, and I came across PTC, and I knew that they were only hiring MBAs. And I went up, I spoke to one of the recruiters there or the HR professional. I said, look, I've got a resume. Why don't you just keep it and let me know if something opens up for undergraduate students? And that was it. I gave my resume, and as luck would have it, they actually called me up for their assessment center and the interview process. And I became probably either the only or one of two undergraduates that got hired as a management trainee at Pakistan Tobacco. Everybody else was an MBA student, either from NUST or LUMS or IBA and so on and so forth. So that was my breakthrough into the professional world.
I would assume it was pretty like taking that initiative. Like a lot of students, they have that struggle or that fear that, oh, we get a rejection, and being able to take that despite the opportunity not actually specifically being for like undergrad students. So how did you get that mindset in terms of just giving it a shot and going from there? Like what stopped you from, or what got you over in terms of just, okay, if I get rejected,
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
it's a great question. Look, I think at the heart of it, I did feel that whether you're an MBA student or an undergrad student, you can do the job, right?
Yeah.
Whatever's being offered to a fresh graduate, irrespective of what degree they hold, right? As long as it's like not a specialized technical job that needs to be done. There was a sentiment in me that, look, if you're coming in for recruiting, it shouldn't really matter whether you're an MBA or a bachelor's if you're coming in for a relatively entry-level position. So that was one. The second is, I think I mentioned I had done my Unilever internship as a sophomore student. And that was also unique because Unilever used to come in for getting interns for their third year, right? So third year students do internships, and then the following year they graduate and get a job offer. And I had success where similarly, Unilever had come in. They hadn't come in specifically for a particular year of students, but most likely they were going to get students for third year, and had success getting an internship as a second year sophomore student at LUMS. So I built that confidence from having achieved that once to then not really care about whether a company's coming in for a MBA, bachelor's, PhD, whatnot. Like I will go and give my resume, and if it happens, doesn't happen, not the end of the world.
So once you completed your professional career in Pakistan, like how did you get introduced to the idea of, okay, Canada is an option, or in the West? Like how did that come up?
Yeah.
Or do you recall? It's been some time, right?
Yeah, it's been some time. I've been in Canada for 6 years now. Look, I applied for immigration, if I'm remembering correctly, and if my memory serves me right, around 2013, right? I had come to the US for my master's in 2011, had gone back to Pakistan in 2013. And then at the time, Canada was changing its immigration process from like the run-of-the-mill paper applications to be filed in to this express entry system. And truth be told, at the time, nobody really knew what it meant to go through an express entry system. It could have been more strict. It could have been more streamlined. Nobody really knew. And my mother actually at the time said, look, why don't you just apply for immigration and we'll figure it out. Just put in your application in. And if it comes through, at least you'll have the option. And the situation in Pakistan at the time was, it's not that way right now, but it was typically that, look, you want to have the security of another passport. So I did that. I applied and forgot about it. And my paperwork and everything came through with the confirmation of permanent residency in about 3 to 4 years' time from my time of application. So by 2016, 17 is the time when that came through. And luckily, I was working with McKinsey. And McKinsey is a tremendously global company, right? I was lucky enough that having been working at McKinsey, I was able to very quickly take the transfer and just take the plunge and come to Canada.
So I guess the transfer, was it pretty easy, or I assume it probably was challenging in its own right, despite being able to leverage the McKinsey experience? How was that process for you?
The process was pretty straightforward, to be honest. I spoke to a few partners at the firm, and by firm McKinsey, I spoke to a few partners who were in Pakistan and Dubai. McKinsey Pakistan is part of the broader Middle East office for McKinsey, right? So I had connections there as well. And they all said that, look, speak to a few people in Canada, in our office here. See if you want to just do one project or an engagement in Canada first, just to get a lay of the land. And then if you think that it makes sense and you like the place and you like the office, just apply for a permanent transfer. And that's what I did. So I called up a few people here in Canada. We've got a professional development department in McKinsey. That's how we kind of staff associates and business analysts and engagement managers to different projects, right? So I spoke to one of them. They said, okay, great. We have you in our kind of radar for the next project that starts up that has a need and you fit the bill for. And I said, great, that's all I'm asking for. I'm not necessarily pressed for time. Whenever something appropriate comes up, let me know. And in like about a couple of months' time, they gave me a call back and said that, yes, there's a project starting in Canada. They're looking for an associate. I was an associate at the time. They're looking for an associate, and I think your profile would work well. Do you want to speak to the engagement manager who's putting the team together? I spoke to him. He said, great. When can you come over? I said, I can come over in a week's time. I was wrapping up a project at the time in Saudi. I wrapped that up, traveled to Canada, did a project, loved it, loved the office. And then essentially I applied for a permanent transfer and came over in 2018.
So I guess that's the work aspect. Then the personal aspect in terms of getting set. Did you already have an idea? Okay, I need to get the driving license.
Yeah.
Like you've done all your the research before actually landing, or was it you land in Canada and you just figured it out as the days went in Canada?
Yeah. So I think the basics I had sorted it out. Like I knew that I have to come to Canada. I'll be on a PR. The first thing I need to do is go get a SIM card, right? Type stuff. I need to figure out where I'm going to live. What are some hot pockets? And I had one child at the time. So my son was about 4 years old when we had come to Canada. So figuring out schooling for him, what schools are good versus not, how does that public school rating system work? All of those things I had to figure out. Luckily, I had some relatives in Canada, cousins of mine who knew the system as well. And then, as I said, one of my mentors was living in Canada as well. So he guided me to when he came in, where did he stay? And I ended up kind of living in a similar location as him when we initially landed. So those things I had to pre-plan. But then once I did come here, there was a lot of learning that happens along the way. You don't know what you don't know, for instance. Even people can tell you that Canada's super cold, but bracing with that weather when it can get to feels like minus 30 at times, it's ridiculous. And it's a learning in itself. So I went through all of that. And then obviously coming from a culture, yes, I had spent a couple of years as a student in the US, and I was with my wife for one of those 2 years when I was doing a master. So we knew what it meant to live independently in a North American kind of society. But coming in with a family, which is like one kid, and then having to do everything yourself without very little domestic support that you get so used to in Pakistan is a learning, right? And it takes a while getting used to it. And you feel that you've got everything under control till you don't, right? Till that time comes when you're exhausted, and my wife has to drop off my son to school in sub-zero temperatures, and she doesn't have a license to drive, so she needs to leverage the bus, but it's snowing outside. Like all of that is just acclimatizing to the new way of living and the society that you're not necessarily used to in the past.
And do you have any advice for, I know like now it's the prices are so high for everything, and for people or Pakistanis who are moving to Canada or the West, do you have any general advice to push through that first few years of struggle in both the personal and the work, and then just getting through that hump? Do you have any thoughts on or any advice for that?
Look, I'll divide that into two, right? So one is the struggle that I have, and given that I transferred with McKinsey, I was very blessed and lucky to land with a job. So that's a huge benefit. But the reason why I'll separate your question out into two is there is the struggle that I've seen a lot of my friends go through in just getting a job in Canada. And then there is the struggle that people go through acclimatizing to the country, the society, the way of living, which is very different, right?
Yeah.
So from a job or professional aspect, in case you're coming in trying to land a job in Canada, I think the first thing that you need to do is be very comfortable putting yourself out there. A lot of people feel discouraged when they hear that, look, the Canadian market values Canadian experience. It is true, but I don't think that's the be all end all, right? It's not as if that you don't have Canadian experience, you're not going to be able to land a job. There is such an high influx of immigration that has happened over the past few years and a lot of people are working and doing just fine, right? The reason why I say you have to put yourself out there is because you need to be very comfortable reaching out to people, pushing for coffee chats, pushing for conversations, trying to figure out what common connection you may have for them, whether it could be someone who you went to university with, someone who you're connected with through another colleague of yours, or just generally works in the industry or space that you're involved with in Pakistan or wherever you're coming from, right? So you should be able to be very comfortable reaching out. So that's number one. You should be equally comfortable or okay for that person to not respond and you to get like a hit rate of 10 to 20%, because that's normal as well. And then once you do form that connection, you should be absolutely comfortable and confident talking about your experience and talking about what you've done, right? And not just asking for an opportunity, but leading with your experience and valuing your experience yourself so that the other person starts to value it too. So I think that's the one advice that I would give people. And then on the personal front, look, it is going to be tough, right? The first few years, whether it's coping with the harsh winters, whether it's trying to figure out how to live in a small apartment that you might not be used to, because if you're living in Toronto, the apartments can be tiny or you're not getting as much bang for your buck and so on and so forth, right? You just need to ride the wave. Focus on the positives. Yes, there is a struggle, but there is also that Canada offers you a great opportunity to travel to North America as well, to broader North America. It gives you an opportunity to do a lot of, especially in Toronto, there's so much to do in good weather outdoors and enjoy that family time. There are cottages that you can go to every few months, so on and so forth. So there's a lot to do as long as you're focusing on that. But yes, the reality is that's going to be tough for the first few years. You just need to mentally brace for it and ride the wave with it.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing that you started off as an associate and now you're like the managing partners and just the growth that you've had. So how did you manage to start associate and then continue building your experience so that you reach the level you are now?
Yeah. So at the firm in McKinsey, the path from an associate to an engagement manager to an associate partner where I am right now is fairly well chalked out, right? You've got competencies and capabilities that you need to tick off across the board. And in consulting, and particularly in McKinsey, unlike in a lot of other places in the industry, you're promoted to your next level of incompetency. So what I mean by that is that you're promoted, for example, if you're a brand manager, you'll get promoted to a senior brand manager or marketing manager without ever having done that marketing manager role, right? You're doing your role, you're doing terrific at your role, and you've done really well, and hence you are worthy of getting promoted to the next level. That's how it typically works, your progression works. At McKinsey and typically like the MBBs, you're promoted once you're able to display the competency of your next level. So you already have to start doing that job before you get actually designated that title. I was in Canada, I was still an associate. I did really well as an associate. Again, I had sponsors. Sponsors are absolutely critical at McKinsey. And those sponsors saw that I could have the ability to do an engagement manager role, for instance. And I worked with them to find that opportunity that, okay, whatever next project that comes that you think is suitable and sets me up for success, can you give me that engagement manager role without me being designated as one? So I did that engagement manager role even while just being an associate and proved myself there, and then got designated as an engagement manager. Same came when I became an associate partner, right? Which is effectively an engagement director. So I had to prove myself that I can be the director for an engagement, and then my sponsors push for my case to be that. But a lot of it is taking that first initiative. So be solid on your job, right? That's the basic. Do your work really well, but then be very conscious and be very specific about what you want to do next and have those deliberate conversations. I had those deliberate conversations so that to make sure that I get the chance to do it, showcase my ability to do it well, and hence chart my path forward.
Got you. Yeah, that is really, I think so. It's like just planning it out, as well as I never really thought about just being able to already show those that you can actually complete the manager role or further on. So yeah, that's a really great point. So I guess for students or people who don't know what consulting involves, like if you were to explain it to someone, not giving any private information or anything, but just like in general, if someone's interested in this field, like how would you explain it to them?
Yeah. So I'll explain to how I'll try and frame it the way I frame it to my kids, right? So I have a 10-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. And in particular, my son has asked me this question a few times of like, Baba, what is it that you do? What does McKinsey do? Or what does consulting do? And it is a tough question to answer up front, but the generic answer is that, look, we as consultants are brought in to solve the toughest problems that companies typically aren't able to solve themselves. So that's like the standard, like generic answer I'd give. To my son, I always say that, look, you know what a doctor does, right? A doctor treats patients and figures out does a diagnosis of what the challenges are for you as a patient. As a consultant, my work is to figure out or diagnose what the challenges could be for a company. And that company could vary depending on the types of clients that I serve. And I do a lot of my work in consumer and retail, essentially. So I deal with them trying to understand what is the challenge. And sometimes the companies themselves or the clients themselves can articulate it because they're faced with that challenge. Sometimes you have to showcase what the challenge could be forward-looking to them, given that you have experience of what others have gone through in that same journey of their maturity as a firm or as a company, right? So sometimes you need to showcase the problem as well as do the diagnosis and then recommend solutions and work with them to actually improve their performance over time. So that's what consulting is, right? It's a lot of new kids coming into consulting feel that, look, it's all you have to do is make pages and do analysis and problem solve situations and so on and so forth. That is true. It is a big component of the work that you do, but a much bigger component is actually people linked. You have to work with your clients hand in glove, not just to understand the challenges, develop recommendations, but make sure those recommendations are actually implemented. And in a lot of times, you're side by side with them to implement it, right? It's not just sitting in the back on your laptop, crunching numbers and coming up with that aha answer. That rarely happens. A lot of the times that you're serving a client for sure, but you're serving people. So it is that service that you're providing. And in that, you need to be able to work with individuals and work and make sure that they're understanding and you're taking them along the journey with what your recommendation is so that it actually comes to life and doesn't become paperweight with 100-page deck at the end of the day.
Got you. And for
long-winded answer, but I hope it somehow paints a picture of what consulting is.
No, it does. In terms of individuals that are interested in breaking in, especially students and university, do you have any advice, like courses or things that they could do to actually break into the large consulting boutique firms?
Yeah. So look, a lot of the universities now, especially those that are a little bit more like business oriented, the business schools ones, have consulting clubs, right? So that's your easiest way to get comfortable and try to understand what consulting is and what the recruitment process would entail, right? Because consulting firms, their recruitment is different from what your industry companies, how they recruit or what their process is. Like for McKinsey, for example, is very case-led. So you have to know what it means to crack a case. And the best way to do that is in a consulting club. And the reason why I'd say a consulting club is because that's where you'll find like-minded people who are interested in that space, and you can partner up with a few and start giving each other cases and practicing that. So that's the best way. And then beyond that, at any given point in time, probably in your last year of university, these consulting firms come in, whether it's McKinsey or others, for recruitment. And that's where you take a shot, apply, and hope that you'll get selected and go through that case process. The one thing I'll say though is that unlike any other bank or consumer goods or retail company coming in to recruit, once you apply and you get selected for an interview, you do need to do a lot of practice, right?
Yeah.
There is a lot that, and the worst thing that you can do is get this interview call up for a consulting firm that you're aspiring to go to, and just because you've gotten it for a certain day, you just show up unprepared. If need be, you should push your interview out. And I know McKinsey is, and a lot of other companies are absolutely okay with that happening, just to give you that extra time to get prepared. And then you should have conversations with, and a lot of these consulting firms set you up with buddies and like case coaching partners and so on and so forth. You should leverage that to the fullest, because every company, like the way McKinsey runs its cases is slightly different from how BCG runs it, slightly different from how Bain would do it, it's different from how Deloitte would do it. So it's good to get that understanding of how that case is going to be structured ahead before you go into that interview, and then practice for that. And you'll get to know it once you leverage those buddies and coaches that company may provide to you as resource to leverage, right? So make sure that you're using that to the fullest.
Got you. So I guess, how do you define success? Like personally, professionally, what's your definition of success?
So my definition of success is in a word which is very difficult to achieve, and that's balance, right?
Okay.
At any given point in time, you are playing so many different hats, right? So you are a father, you're a husband, you're a son, you're a friend, you're a professional with responsibilities, and you'll be pulled in multiple different directions at any given point in time, right? I think, and it's also okay to not be perfectly balanced across all roles that you play in an isolated moment. But for me, success is that over a period of time, when you look back, you've not let any of those balls fall significantly. So you've kept that balance across the different hats that you've worn and done justice to each one of them. It's a very difficult thing to do. And wherever you've pivoted one way or the other, you're comfortable and conscious of that pivot. So if you've over-indexed on, let's say, developing a professional career because you're starting off on a journey in Canada and you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward and doing the hard yards because you want to set your base up for success later on. And in that moment, you've fallen back on some of the responsibilities of the house or as a friend or whatnot. That's a conscious decision that you've taken, and make sure that your loved ones around you who need to pick up that slack after you, because somebody needs to do it, right? If you're scaling back on some of your parent duties, then presumably your spouse needs to cover it up. That you've taken them into confidence while you're doing it, right? And it's not an infinite period of time. So finding that balance holistically overall for me is success. So that when you look back on your journey as a parent, as a brother, as a friend, as a son, you can say, yes, satisfied to some extent of how I've cultivated those relationships and how I fulfilled my responsibilities towards that hat that I wore.
Awesome. No, that's really good. So I guess to end things off, children, like son and daughters that are raised in the West, do you have any specific cultural traits or Pakistani cultural traits that one you think should try maintaining as they progress? Because as you're raised here, you forget those some of the cultural values, or might forget some of them. So do you have any ones that you think should be or try to be maintained as people grow up here in the West?
Look, I think what should be maintained is a very subjective thing, right? Like, I can tell you what I have tried to maintain as my family, right? So I feel that for us, something as like Eid, for instance, right? Or Ramadan or Ramazan, however you wish to pronounce it, is a cultural or a religious element that I've made sure that we maintain in my house. And one way to do that is, I think we probably celebrate that more while being in Canada consciously than we did in Pakistan, because in Pakistan everybody's celebrating, like Eid.
Yeah, exactly.
Eid is a holiday for everybody, right? So you don't need to make that extra effort to make it special, because it is special. we have to make that extra effort to make it special here. So for example, we've got a very close, tightly knit group of friends in Canada, and all of us are in a very similar kind of life stage cycle, right? With married with kid or kids in similar age brackets. So what we make sure is that come Eid, all of us are, to whatever extent possible, taking off. If it's not a weekend or a public holiday, right? We take off. We make sure that we gather together. We exchange gifts. We dress up in like our cultural traditional Pakistani clothing. We will have the Pakistani nashta and everything, right? We've tried to maintain that, and the result of that is that my kids are very excited about Eid, right?
Yeah.
Because they know that this is like an event that happens. So that's like at the macro event level. I think there's a ton of stuff that happens which is cultural and value based that I at least try to maintain in my house on a more regular basis, right? And when I say I am including my wife in here as well, because she's equal, if not more, of a driving force towards these values. So for example, I want to make sure that both my kids, their sets of grandparents are in Pakistan. So a week should not go by without them having some form of contact or connect with them. So those types of values of respecting elders, having that connection with family back home, hold that very dear to me. And I want to make sure that my kids do the same as they grow up as well.
Awesome. No, thank you so much. That was great. Like you talked about so many different areas, and I feel it's a pretty broad range of things that we talked about. So thank you so much for being on the interview, and it was a pleasure interviewing you.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. By the way, this is a tremendous initiative. I applaud you for it. And thank you for doing this, because I feel that, and I did go through a few of your previous videos as well, where you interviewed other professionals, which was great. And I think more with the number of people who are moving towards the West now from Pakistan, opportunities to hear from others who've been through a similar journey would just hold them in good stead. And hopefully even one thing from this interview or other interviews that you've done, if it resonates with someone, more power to you for that.
Awesome. Thank you.